My wife laughed when she saw me walk into the conference room to hear the will read. It was not a relieved laugh. It was the kind that froze the room. My daughter-in-law was the opposite. She went pale, like she had just realized a mistake she could never fix. I stood there in my old suit. They looked at me like a man who no longer had the right to speak. They thought I was there to beg, or to be quietly erased. None of them understood this. I did not show up to hold on to anything. I showed up to close a door. Before I go on, if you feel this story is worth listening to, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. Your presence is the reason I keep telling this story. And then that morning, I stepped into the conference room, and I did not rush to sit down. I did not sit down right away. I let them wait a few seconds longer, just long enough for the discomfort to creep in. The law firm's conference room was on the top floor. The windows looked out over the Charleston harbor, blurred by fog. The fall morning drained the light of its color, as if the city itself was wary of what was about to happen. I was used to being treated as unnecessary. Julian did not bother to stand. My son glanced at the worn leather briefcase in my hand, then looked to Genevieve as if to confirm everything was still under their control. She pressed her lips together, trying to stay composed, but her fingers tapping lightly on the table betrayed the impatience underneath. Rose sat beside them. My wife. She did not look at me at first. Only when I pulled out the chair did she raise her head and smile. That smile tipped the balance of the room. It was not gentle, not mocking either. It felt like a signal arranged in advance, one only two people understood. I placed my file on the table. Not read. I saw Genevieve tilt her head slightly. She had been expecting a different folder, something prepared to end all debate, something meant to make official the story that I was no longer of sound mind. Julian cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. "We should begin," he said, in that flat tone he used when signing loans he could not really afford. The lawyer nodded and opened the folder in front of Julian. A single page was slid into the center of the table. I did not need to look closely to know what it was. A competency evaluation. My name printed neatly at the top, followed by cold language about memory and judgment. Julian called it a necessary procedure. Genevieve looked at me with rehearsed patience, as if waiting for me to admit I was a burden. Rose laughed, not loudly, just enough for everyone to hear. "You still think you have the right to speak, Philip," she said, her voice light, like reminding me to close a window. Julian relaxed. Genevieve smiled quickly, then pulled it back. They thought this moment was over. They thought I would react, explain, or sink into quiet humiliation. I did none of that. I opened my briefcase, took out a navy blue folder, and placed it neatly in front of the lawyer. "This is mine," I said. My voice was steady, not loud, not shaking. I had practiced speaking that way for a long time. The lawyer looked at me hesitating. He was used to working with people who believed power lived in youth and confidence. Still, he opened my folder. I saw Genevieve's color change. Not all at once. First, a blink that lasted a second too long. Then her hand tightened around the edge of her chair. The first pages had nothing to do with the will. No disputes, no petitions to overturn anything. Just transaction records, timelines, figures carefully marked and cross-referenced. Julian leaned in to read. I saw the exact moment he realized this was not what he had prepared for. He looked up at me, for the first time that morning, as if he were looking at a stranger. "What is this?" he asked. I did not answer. I let the lawyer keep reading. Lines about digital asset transfers, shell companies, tax obligations never mentioned at family dinners. I had spent many nights organizing them, quietly, alone, in the apartment they thought was a safe cage for an old man. Genevieve stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly behind her. "This isn't relevant," she said, a little too quickly. "We're here too." The lawyer raised a hand, signaling her to sit. He no longer looked at Genevieve. His eyes stayed on the pages, then slowly lifted to me. "Mr. Phillip," he said, "would you like to explain these documents?" I looked at Rose. She was no longer smiling. She gave a very slight nod. That was all. "I did not come here to argue about my memory," I said. "I came to make sure that what has been hidden does not stay in the dark." No one spoke. Outside, a ship's horn sounded from the harbor. I thought of all the mornings when I believed silence was the best way to keep peace in a family. That morning, I understood something else. Silence, when it lasts too long, is mistaken for permission. and I had come to take that permission back. The lawyer closed the folder and said he would need time to verify everything. The meeting was suspended. People stood up and moved slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to leave the room. Genevieve avoided my eyes. Julian walked quickly into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. Rose walked beside me without saying a word. Her hand brushed my sleeve just enough to let me know she was there. While we waited, my memory drifted back 2 years earlier, to when it all began with offers that sounded kind. Back then, Rose and I were still living on the Chestnut Farm north of the city. The land was not large, but it was enough for us to wake up to damp wind and birdsong in the morning. Julian and Genevieve visited one summer weekend. They talked a lot about traffic, about medical access, about how older people should not live too far from the center. Genevieve spoke the most. Her voice was gentle. She emphasized safety. She emphasized long-term care. They suggested we sell the farm, move into a luxury apartment where everything was taken care of. Rose hesitated. I stayed quiet. I had grown used to staying quiet during big decisions, thinking it was a way to respect our children. After many conversations, after many promises, we agreed. The new apartment was downtown. Bright, clean, everything was managed for us. But after a few months, I noticed the fees creeping up. Extra services appeared regularly on the bills. Rose complained that the meals were no longer what they had been at first. I asked Genevieve. She smiled and said it was standard. I began reading the paperwork more carefully. During one account review, I saw loans taken out in my name that I did not remember signing. I asked Julian. He said it was to optimize cash flow. He said I had agreed. I did not argue. I started taking notes. One evening, I checked the camera in my grandson's room. At first, it was just to watch him sleep, but sound carried in from the living room. Genevieve was talking to Julian. Her voice was no longer gentle. She talked about one final power of attorney document. She said that once I signed, everything would be clean. She said then they could move me to a more isolated unit, where fewer people asked questions. I turned off the screen. I sat in the dark for a long time. I did not feel anger right away. I felt emptiness, a familiar coldness, the kind you feel when plans are altered behind your back. From that day on, I changed how I behaved. I moved more slowly. I repeated questions I had already asked. I let Julian correct me in front of others. I let Genevieve guide my hand as I signed minor documents. I let them believe their plan was moving forward. Meanwhile, I backed everything up. Old contracts, ownership certificates, transaction histories. I recorded every time Rose did not receive her full prescription, every unexplained reduction in funds. I did not tell her right away. I needed to be certain. One night, Rose stepped into my small study. She placed her hand on the stack of papers and looked at me for a long time. "You think I didn't notice?" she asked. I shook my head. I told her I did not want her to worry. She smiled, not like the smile in the conference room. She said she had stayed silent for the same reason. From then on, we worked together, without many words. Rose pretended to trust Genevieve. She offered to help manage a few accounts for convenience. Genevieve agreed faster than I expected. Maybe she thought Rose was easier to handle. Rose memorized passwords. She passed information to me each night on small slips of paper tucked inside books. There was one incident Genevieve called an accident. A burning smell spread through the apartment. The alarm went off. Everyone was evacuated. Some papers in my study were damaged. Genevieve acted panicked. She apologized again and again. I nodded. I said it was fine. She did not know those papers were only copies. When we returned, I saw her eyes scan the cabinets. I understood she was checking to see if anything else needed to disappear. I said nothing. I stayed in my role. 2 years passed like that. Each day a small step. Each step required patience. I told no one else. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew that if I spoke too soon, everything would collapse in ways no one could control. And then that morning, at the law office arrived. When I placed the navy blue folder on the table, I was not just carrying figures. I was carrying 2 years of silence, organized, neat, and clear. In the hallway, Rose looked at me and said softly, "Now they will have to listen." I nodded. I knew this was only the beginning of the story, but at least the sweet trap they had built for us had begun to close on itself. After Rose spoke, we went back into the conference room. The lawyer was already seated, his glasses placed neatly on the table. Julian and Genevieve came in after us. No one greeted anyone. The silence lasted just long enough for everyone to feel like they were standing on a floor that was no longer solid. I sat down this time, not because I was tired, but because there was no longer a reason to stand. In the days that followed, things moved slowly, the way legal matters always do. Documents needed verification. Figures needed to be reconciled. I did not rush anything. I let time do its work. Meanwhile, I continued the role I had been playing for 2 years now. The forgetful old man. Distracted. Easy to guide. Genevieve became more attentive. She asked if I needed extra help. She suggested I sign a few papers for convenience. I read slowly. I asked questions again. I signed what was harmless and let the rest drift past. Each time I wrote things down. The time, the setting, who was present. I no longer trusted my memory. I trusted evidence. I also began watching the small details more closely. The way Genevieve adjusted her words when a third person entered the room. The way Julian avoided my eyes when money came up. The quick nods they exchanged between themselves. None of that appeared in the records, but it spoke louder than any figure ever could. Rose continued her part. In front of them, she appeared more tired. She complained about her medication. She asked to reduce the dosage, saying she couldn't tolerate it. Genevieve agreed immediately, as if granting a favor. I recorded the dates, the bills, the quantities. There were gaps. Small ones, but repeated. One afternoon, Genevieve suggested rearranging the apartment. She said my study took up too much space. I nodded. I let her and her people in. I stood on the balcony, watching the stream of people below. After they left, I checked. Drawers had been opened. Some folders had shifted. I said nothing. That night, I opened my computer. Everything I needed was there. Digital copies. Named by date and time. Stored where Genevieve would never think to look. I was not a technology expert, but I understood structure. I understood that if something mattered, it needed layers of protection. Rose sat beside me. She did not ask questions. She looked at the screen, then at me. We did not need to talk about trust. It had already been tested long enough. A few weeks later, there was another incident. This time, the burning smell was stronger. The alarm sounded again. Everyone was told to leave the apartment. I stood in the hallway and saw Genevieve speaking quickly with building management. She pointed toward my study. I lowered my head, looking confused. When we returned, some papers were damaged. I sighed. I said I could not remember what had been there. Genevieve apologized, her voice full of concern. I accepted the apology. I knew she was checking one last time. After that, Genevieve grew more confident. She spoke about finalizing the process. She brought up the competency evaluation again. Julian stayed quiet, but I could see his impatience growing. Debt does not wait. I knew pressure was pushing them closer to the edge. The lawyer contacted me again. He said another meeting was needed. I agreed. I did not tell Julian right away. I let Genevieve discover it instead. She called me, her voice tense. I told her I would be there. The night before the meeting, Rose and I sat across from each other in the kitchen. The tea grew cold. She asked if I was sure. I said nothing was ever certain, but some things, if left undone, turn into a habit of silence. She nodded. She smiled very softly. I understood that smile. That morning I chose my old suit, not because I had no others, but because I wanted them to see the image they were used to. I placed the navy blue folder into my briefcase. I checked everything one last time, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the process. In the conference room, Genevieve tried to stay composed. Julian did not. He asked more questions than usual. He talked about finishing quickly. I let the lawyer speak. I let the documents come out in the order already set. When the lawyer reached details that only Genevieve and I knew, I saw her expression change. Not fear, recognition. The realization that there was a part of her plan she had never seen. The realization that the man she believed had been set aside had been watching every step. I did not say much. I did not need to. What needed to surface was already surfacing on its own. I sat there listening to pages turn, listening to the breathing in the room change. Outside, the morning light remained pale. I thought of the 2 years gone by, of silent evenings, of the moments I asked myself whether I was doing the right thing or simply delaying the inevitable. Then I remembered something simple. Silence is not weakness, if it is used to prepare. And that day the preparation stepped into the light. The lawyer stopped midway through, took off his glasses, and placed them on the table. He looked around the room as if confirming that everyone who needed to be there was present. Then he said a sentence none of them had prepared themselves to hear. "Today's meeting is not to read or amend Mr. Philip's will." Julian frowned. Genevieve leaned forward slightly, lips parted, but no sound came out. I stayed silent. I knew this moment was coming. I just did not know how heavy it would feel. "We are here," the lawyer continued to announce the will of Mr. Arthur. The room seemed to tilt for a few seconds. Arthur was my younger brother, a man Julian had met only a handful of times, and someone Genevieve never bothered to hide her disdain for because he lived quietly and did not attend family gatherings. They knew Arthur had assets. They just believed those assets were beyond my reach. Genevieve turned to Julian and whispered something. Julian shook his head, as if trying to push away an unwelcome assumption. I watched them with the familiar feeling of someone who has seen structures collapse because of false premises. The lawyer began reading. My name appeared not as a secondary beneficiary, but as the sole authorized trustee with full authority over the trust. The decision had been signed and certified 6 months earlier when Arthur was still fully lucid and of sound mind. I heard Genevieve inhale sharply. She looked at me, no longer bothering to hide her confusion. "This isn't valid," she said, her voice higher than usual. Mr. Philip has." The lawyer raised a hand. "The documents have been reviewed," he said. "Mr. Arthur's decision does not depend on any evaluation of Mr. Philip." Julian turned toward me. The look in his eyes was no longer contempt. It was a question asked too late. I did not answer. I let the lawyer continue. There are moments when another person's words carry more weight, especially when the truth needs to stand on its own. When the section on distribution of interests was read, Genevieve could no longer sit still. She stood up, one hand on the table. "Julian is immediate family," she said. "This isn't fair." The lawyer nodded slowly. Fairness, he said, was considered very carefully by Mr. Arthur. Then he moved on to the next part, the part I had been waiting for. The recordings were referenced, not as accusations, but as part of the review of beneficiary eligibility. Conversations about cutting living expenses, about letting them adjust on their own, about the convenience of older people no longer asking questions. There were no harsh words, just plain statements placed in a context that could not be denied. Genevieve shook her head. "That's a misunderstanding," she said. "We were only—" "Please let me finish," the lawyer replied. He continued reading one segment at a time. I did not look at Genevieve then. I looked at Julian. I wanted to see how my son would react when there was nowhere left to turn away. Julian sat back down. His shoulders collapsed inward. I recognized the moment he understood that every choice he had made had led here. Not because I set a trap, but because he had walked too far inside his own silence. The lawyer concluded the reading. He spoke about safeguard clauses, about removing beneficiary rights from anyone who caused harm or exploited another person's vulnerability. He did not use heavy language. He simply named the actions for what they were. Genevieve dropped back into her chair. She did not cry. She stared into the empty space in front of her as if recalculating a plan that had just lost its foundation. Julian turned to me, his lips moving. "I didn't know it would end up like this," he said. "I looked at my son for a long time. I thought of the evenings I waited up for him, the times I told myself the pressure would pass, that he only needed more time." I stood up. "You don't owe me obedience," I said evenly. "You owe yourself clarity." Julian lowered his head. I did not step closer. I did not put a hand on his shoulder. Some distances need to remain so people understand that a line has been crossed. The lawyer announced the meeting was adjourned. Papers were gathered. Genevieve left first. She did not look back. Julian hesitated, then followed her. The door closed, the sound soft but final. Only Rose, the lawyer, and I remained. Rose held my hand. Her grip was warm and steady. The lawyer said he would send the official copies. I nodded. When we stepped into the hallway, the light had changed. Not brighter, just clearer. I took a slow breath. I did not feel relief. I felt a necessary ending. That reading of the will did not give me a sense of victory. It gave me a true silence. And in that silence, I knew the doors had been closed. Not to trap anyone, but to keep certain things from ever entering again. We left the law office when the morning was already halfway gone. The hallway was long and quiet. Rose walked more slowly than usual, as if she wanted to be sure that what had just happened was real. I did not rush her. Some moments need to be walked through at their own pace. Outside, wind from the harbor carried the familiar scent of salt water. We paused at the steps for a moment. Rose looked at me without speaking. She did not need to ask how I felt. We had learned to read each other's silence a long time ago. On the drive home, my phone vibrated. Julian was calling. I did not answer. Not out of anger, but because I knew that conversation needed a different space, not a moving car, rolling through the old streets of Charleston. I silenced the phone. Rose placed her hand over mine. She nodded. Our apartment welcomed us with its familiar quiet. I went straight to the front door. The lock had been with us for 2 years. A good lock, but no longer the right one. I took a new lock from the drawer. I replaced it slowly, step by step. There was nothing overly symbolic about it. It was simply a necessary task, like changing a habit that had grown old. When I tightened the final screw, Rose made tea. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from me. We drank in silence. I realized I was no longer thinking about spreadsheets, numbers, or lines in legal files. Not because they no longer mattered, but because their role had ended. That afternoon, we stepped out onto the balcony. The Charleston harbor opened up before us, quiet, unimpressed. I thought about the old farm, about early mornings and rows of trees. I felt no regret. Places like people sometimes need to be left to preserve what they truly are. Julian called again that evening. This time I answered. His voice was low and tired. He apologized. He said things had gone out of control. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped, I said the sentence I had carried for a long time. You don't owe me repayment for raising you, Julian. You owe yourself a moral compass. Silence stretched on the other end. I did not add anything, not because I had nothing left to say, but because some words lose their weight when you pile more on top. I wished him peace and ended the call. The weeks that followed passed without urgency. Procedures were completed. Authority was transferred exactly as outlined. I did not track every detail. I left that work to those responsible for it. Rose and I focused on something else. We met with lawyers and social advocates, not to tell our story, but to listen to others. There were older people placed in similar situations without the time or patience to wait things out. I realized that if my silence had once been misunderstood, then my clarity now might help someone avoid the same fate. We used part of the assets to build a small organization. No large signs, no loud campaigns. Just a place that offered guidance, basic legal support, and most importantly, someone willing to listen. I did not put my name out front. I did not need to. I had stood in enough positions in my life already. Rose joined in her own way. She met people. She talked. She took notes. She had a gift for making others feel safe when saying difficult things. Watching her work for the first time in a long while, I saw a smile that did not need to hide. One afternoon we returned to the balcony. The tea was still hot. The harbor was still there. I thought about the reading of the will, about the smile that unsettled the room. I understood then that it was neither mockery nor victory. It was a signal that we had not been locked inside a cage designed by someone else. I changed the lock not to imprison myself, but to draw a boundary. Family, I learned perhaps too late, is not a place for investment returns. It is a place to preserve decency. When decency is worn away, boundaries must be set. Not to punish, but to protect. Evening settled in slowly. Rose leaned against my shoulder. I did not think about what had been lost. I thought about what had been kept. This silence was no longer heavy. It was complete, like a room finally put in order. And in that quiet, I knew my story did not end with closing a door, but with opening a new space, one where no one needed to laugh or turn pale when they saw me walk in. Thank you for staying with me until the final moments of this story. If it touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so others can hear it too. Sometimes a story told at the right moment helps someone realize they are not alone. The lesson I want to leave is simple. A parent's silence is not weakness. It is often sacrifice. Family is not a place to keep score. It is a place to protect decency. When boundaries are set at the right time, no one truly loses. Only peace is preserved.